At the time, I was basically sitting on my couch, freelance writing, and watching reruns of Law & Order SVU. So I'm like, this certainly beat that.
Nice to see your face in this environment and not just on a, I feel like every time I'm watching, especially like the games in London, I always see a commercial with your mug in it and you talking on set.
Yeah, it's funny because I've been my face has been in the commercial, the promo for a while. They've never given me a quote in it. And this year they've given me a quote and they spliced together two things where I say, he's a big, strong guy. He's the guy I want. And my wife thinks it is the funniest thing ever. When she sees it, she rewinds it and makes me listen to it over and over again.
That's true. Now that I'm thinking about it, that is what you're saying in that commercial, which is unbelievably amazing. That's so perfect. But yeah, man, it's good to sit down and chop it up a little bit. I was also thinking, you get the Geno Smith doppelganger. I get the Joe Flacco doppelganger all the time. So this is just Geno Smith and Joe Flacco chopping it up today. That's all this is.
Obviously, exactly. Just two veteran quarterbacks talking about the game. That's all it is.
That's right. So look, with late round perspectives, I always like to start off the conversation to let you sort of talk through your journey, let folks know where you've come from and how you got to where you are. I mean, you're at the flagship, if you will, with NFL Network. And do you guys call it like would you consider, do you, when someone says, where do you work? Do you say NFL Network or the NFL or NFL media?
I sort of interchange all three of them, to be honest with you. I work for the NFL. I work at NFL Network. I work for NFL. Yeah, they're all sort of interchangeable.
It's me. Okay. I never knew. I didn't know if it was if there was like a go-to for folks. I was because I will have an intro for you for the show itself, and I gotta make sure I get that right. But anyway, let everyone know sort of like how you got into this space, where it all started, where the passion came from, all that good stuff.
Yeah, I always tell people that this job sort of found me more than I went looking for it. I had worked in radio in various forms for a long time. I did minor league baseball play-by-play for 2 seasons. I worked for some local radio stations, covering a lot of high school and junior college sports and doing just kind of local sports talk radio for a while. Was lucky to get a job with a national sports radio network, which was then Sporting News Radio. They've morphed into several other things since then. But after working there for like a year and a half, 2 years, the company was sold. The owner wanted to move operations to Houston. They offered me a chance. I said, I'm a California guy through and through, born and raised, wanted to stay in Los Angeles. I figured I will stick it out and just try my hand and figure something else out. So I was fun employed for about 11 months. A former coworker at the radio network suggested I apply to jobs at the NFL. He had been working there seasonally, said they're always looking for folks in season. So I literally went to like NFL.com/jobs or whatever the website is. Yeah. And applied for like 5 or 6 things, most of which I wasn't qualified for. Nothing happened for a while. So this is 2011. The lockout was happening, and they weren't even sure if there was going to be a season that year. So I applied to stuff. It just sort of went out into the void, and I didn't know what was going to happen. I kind of forgot about it. I got a phone call several months later from Michael Fabiano asking me if I wanted to apply for a job or interview for a job writing about fantasy football. And I'm like, well, does it pay? And he's like, yeah. I was like, sure. Because at the time I was basically sitting on my couch, freelance writing and watching reruns of Law & Order SVU. So I'm like, this certainly beat that. So I went in. Fun fact, I actually, the night before the interview, I read a whole bunch of his columns and I regurgitated his information back to him in the interview. Nice. The day the lockout ended, I remember I woke up in the morning, I turned on ESPN. They were announcing the lockout is over. The league and the players union have come to a decision. There will be football this year. A couple of hours after that, I got a phone call saying I was hired. I was a seasonal employee for the first couple of years. So like I started in August. I would work till like March. Then they would send me back out into the wilderness and I would come back next August. So after a couple of years of that, they hired me full time. I was able to sort of con my way onto some guest appearances on the podcast, a couple of cameos on the TV show. And here we are 13 years later in my 14th season. And it's sort of blossomed into something nice for me.
That's crazy, man. I feel like have they changed sort of like I remember other people that, I've known in the space that worked there and whatnot that kind of went through the same path of like being seasonal for a while and then like that turning into full time. Was that also sort of just like, hey, we don't know if fantasy football is like this big of a market and this big of a thing right now, so we can't really dedicate that many resources to it?
It's sort of the 7 month thing, the seasonal thing is kind of a rite of passage around here. In all departments, right? Like fantasy, just across all departments, a lot of times they'll just bring people in for the season, have them work for 7 months. If you are sort of lucky and you get tapped on the shoulder to get a full-time job, then that's certainly a great thing. But I mean, I'll say this, for us, it's good and bad, right? Like it's nice to kind of be able to bring people in and kind of get them up to speed and teach them things. But we always sort of like to kind of build a group. I mean, look, we had Matt Harmon here for years, right? And that dude is a huge star now. I mean, we had guys like Alex Gelhar who were here for years, Matt Franciscovich. I mean, we kind of built our own little group, which was really fun. For the folks out there who remember us, I mean, we still talk. We're still all friends. We still keep in touch and close contact. So that's cool. Definitely sad that part of it ended, but it was sort of nice to be able to work together and kind of build that camaraderie.
Yeah, that was a fun day and age. Those like looking back, you guys definitely had like great camaraderie. And then you would also get the random pictures on Twitter of you guys out at the bar and stuff. Just like it wasn't just solely. It made me, as someone who's just always worked from home alone, without not really in the office space and stuff. It did make me a little bit jealous that you guys were able to do that and hang out. Did you like from a fantasy perspective? Like, did you ever have your sights set on it being fantasy football? You said that you did some play-by-play stuff. Was football the passion, or was it just like sports in general for you?
It was mostly sports in general. I mean, I think if I had a first love sports-wise, it was probably baseball, but I definitely liked football a lot. I would say when I started this job, I didn't play fantasy like on a high competitive level. I played it socially. I was in one league because it was a chance to keep in contact with friends from high school. I joined another league. I moved to a new city for a job, and one of my coworkers invited me into his league. And I'm like, well, it's a good chance for me to meet new people in a city where I don't know anybody. So I never really played it on a high level until I started in this. When I told my friends that I got the gig doing fantasy football for the NFL, I got so many more offers to be in fantasy leagues from people. Right. But I was never really that into it. It was just kind of a fun pastime, just kind of a different way to watch football.
Yeah, which is crazy to think about because I feel like those kinds of opportunities, like the way that folks kind of got into the space in that time frame. I mean, I started around the exact same time. Actually, it was like around I started writing my ebook like in the lockout season. Then it came out the next season and stuff. But it seems like now when folks are getting jobs within the space, it's because they're like insanely. Like they just love the game so much more than anyone else. And that's why they're getting the job in the space, Yeah,
100%. And it's funny. I've started kind of telling people that, I'm always glad to give advice to people who are looking to get into the space. But I also tell people that like, I might be one of the worst people to ask because my first job in the space was with the NFL. Like, I didn't have the process of, grinding through a blog or writing for a small site. Like I walked into a situation that was ready-made. Like I'm grateful for it. I'm fortunate. It's given me a very good life. But for somebody who's just starting and trying to figure out how to get their foot in the door, I keep telling I'm probably not the best person to come to with that advice because I didn't have that journey to get to where I am.
Yeah, it's really interesting because like I talked to RotoPat last week and his is kind of like, okay, I did like a little short stint at like Rotoballer or something like that. And then it was Roto World and it's just still been Roto World ever since. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of like, it's the same time frame as all of this, as all of us kind of entering the space and whatnot. And things have definitely changed. But you, man, I mean, like I've seen you get so much better, not just like because look, what you do with your job is a lot different than what the standard fantasy analyst is going to be doing for their job. And I think that's lost at times with people is that like you have to have a certain presence on television, which is a completely different skill set as grinding spreadsheets, if you will, right? And putting a data dump thread on Twitter together, And I think that, I've seen it. I've seen you get a lot better, but you're also getting better as an analyst. It's just great to see all around. So don't sell yourself short thinking that like, oh, I got in at NFL and like there's been tons and tons of growth still, on your end for sure.
I appreciate that. And here's the thing, what I've learned about where I am too is sort of having to speak to a much broader audience at the same
100%.
time. You know,
Yeah.
like we get a lot of folks who, we get folks who are definitely hardcore into this thing. But we also get a lot of folks who are just like, I just play it in a work league or a family league, and I'm trying not to look like a jerk. So it's kind of being able to speak to them. So like I don't pretend to be a spreadsheet grinder or a tape grinder, but I certainly pay attention to what you guys and all those other folks are doing, because I need to be able to kind of take a lot of that information and distill it down for an audience that maybe is playing on a more casual level. And so, I've figured out that is a skill in and of itself. So it's always sort of about trying to get better and read other people and watch other people and sort of figure out, obviously get my own research and kind of do my own thing, but also kind of be able to figure out what other people are doing and being able to kind of take that information and kind of spread the gospel that way.
Yeah, that's how Bob Harris talked about it when I had him on a few weeks ago. It's a similar process of be open-minded and realize that other people are good at different things, and take those different things and make sure that you're like absorbing as much as you possibly can, because why wouldn't you when there's more information?
Exactly.
So all right, so a lot of stuff went down this week. We got to get to some actual fantasy takes here. We had two massive trades go down earlier this week. It was hilarious because the Jets go out, they get Davante Adams, then literal hours later, the Bills, after the Bills had beat them the previous night, the Bills go out and sort of like almost one up them and try to, and getting Amari Cooper. So my question to you, let's start with Davante Adams and the Jets. How do you see this whole thing playing out? And do you straight up, are you more on the Adams side or the Garrett Wilson side rest of season?
I mean, I'm probably more on the Adams side, only because we have seen Aaron Rodgers when he is with guys that he's comfortable with, right? Yep. I mean, there's a reason Allen Lazard has been a thing for the first 6 weeks of the season, because, Rodgers has worked with him. He can trust him. He knows where he's going to be. And so now you have the ultimate version of that with Davante Adams. It's funny because I think Aaron Rodgers in a lot of ways is sort of like Adam Sandler, where he just keeps bringing his friends along for all of the movies that he keeps making. Like that is Aaron Rodgers, right? Bringing along Allen Lazard and digging up Randall Cobb every once in a while, sort of thing. So now he gets Davante Adams in there. That being said, Garrett Wilson is not going to go away. He's still way too talented to not have a role in this offense. Now you've got a really dangerous 1-2 punch that you have to try and defend. I think the upside for Wilson is they can move him around a little bit. Now they can maybe try him in the slot, try to get some more matchups with him there and get him the football. So I think this elevates him a lot. At this point, Mike Williams is basically persona non grata, and who knows if he sticks around, right? Like maybe he ends up getting shipped out in a trade somewhere at some point. But, he was obviously struggling to sort of connect with Rodgers in the first place. We've had 2 Jets games basically end on Rodgers trying to target Williams and getting picked off. That's pretty much a wrap. And then Malachi Corley, who was supposed to be discount Deebo Samuel, not only gets his numbers snatched away from him by Davante Adams, who shows up in New York, but now there's even fewer targets for him to go around. So I think for the rest of the season, this is the Adams and Wilson show with maybe a little bit of Tyler Conklin sprinkled in for good measure.
Yeah, I think that the call out of Wilson being able to move around the formation and stuff is really important to his potential fantasy value. I agree. I like Adams. I think Adams is like a high end 2 and Wilson's more like a mid range 2, kind of in that maybe even lower end. But regardless, it's like I go back to the game that they had against Denver, where if you have this other piece in Davante Adams, imagine Adams being able to take away some of that coverage. But then you can move both these guys inside out. You can do a lot of creative things, and then all of a sudden, from like a production standpoint and like a fantasy standpoint, you're now getting maybe a less scary floor in those situations when you're getting a Patrick Surtain and that all you can't even throw that way, and you only have one weapon that you can really rely on. So maybe he'll get some volume, but not nearly enough. But at least now you can maybe throw him in the slot a little bit more, win on efficiency a little bit more. And like you said, Garrett Wilson's a really good player. Are we going to be surprised if they combine to see half of the team's targets, like each see 25%? Feels like that's almost probable at this point, right?
Yeah, absolutely it is. And I think part of it too, as you mentioned, some of the matchups, right? I think early in the season, we weren't seeing big numbers out of Garrett Wilson. He had some really tough matchups. They start the season with the 49ers. He's locked up on Diamador Lenore. Then they face the Titans. He's got L'Jarius Sneed. He goes Patrick Surtain. He goes Christian Gonzalez. Yeah. He was seeing some of the top corners in the league in the first 4 weeks of the season and was really struggling to get open. So now you've got Davante Adams, who probably is going to eat some of those matchups, who you feel a little bit better about winning some of those one-on-ones. And now they can kind of play a little bit more fast and loose with Wilson's role and maybe get him on some better situations there.
Yeah, exactly. Like Adams is the guy that can play the perimeter. Like they get the Steelers this weekend. They'll get Joey Porter Jr. And now, instead of that being like this daunting matchup for Garrett Wilson, you don't actually feel as bad about it because you know that he's not going to just line up against them on every snap. And Davante Adams can take some of that away. And like at the end of the day, man, like this is no shade to Garrett Wilson, who I think is very, 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 very good, right? But he's not the same kind of receiver as Davante Adams, right? Like he's not like this game breaking. Like Davante Adams is a Hall of Fame wide receiver that we're talking about here, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not, it's to me, Garrett Wilson has always just been like a Chris Olave type, Jalen Waddle, maybe like in not necessarily as players per se, like as archetypes, but like more so just like the kind of impact that they can make on a game and in a game. It's not to say anything bad. Those are two very, very, very good wide receivers. Mm-hmm. It's just that we're talking Davante Adams here, and he hasn't seen a dip, which is why, I think that this is a decently big deal for this offense, even though there are obviously other issues with the offense in general.
No doubt. I want to ask you real quick though. Do you think we elevated Garrett Wilson a little bit too soon? Right, like we were putting him at the end of the first round, early second round, thinking of him as like a legit lockdown, low end wide receiver one. Did we jump the gun on that?
I think to a degree, yeah, because I'll say this. I think that part of that valuation, because I had him as like an early 2, I think in my rankings or something like that. I think part of that, but I was also pretty wide receiver heavy. But part of the evaluation there was the lack of competition, because to me, this is at the end. This is still a mathematical game and a math-driven game, right? Like this is a numbers-driven game at the end of the day. And the way that every team is a 100% target share pie, right? No, I'm not, we can say what we want about like vacated targets and how targets are earned, and target share is earned, right? And Garrett Wilson is going to earn target share, but you can't tell me that Garrett Wilson is going to have the same target share, with Davante Adams as he did without Davante Adams. He had against Minnesota, his target share was 43%. That kind of game is not going to happen anymore for Garrett Wilson with Davante Adams, in the mix. So I think from the standpoint of like a projection, I don't know if he was like massively, like in hindsight, even, and like looking at how things have gone down, maybe we overstated his ability a little bit to be sort of that sole guy. My stance was like, I didn't see a massive difference between like Garrett Wilson to Drake London, for instance, where like they both had veteran quarterbacks coming off of Achilles, and they both were in line to kind of be their dudes in the offense. And you could argue the reason I had Garrett Wilson ahead was because his competition was a little worse than what Drake London was seeing. But yeah, I mean, like I didn't see a reason to draft Garrett Wilson over like AJ Brown, where we knew he was a game-changing wide receiver, and we didn't necessarily have all of that just yet with Wilson. Is that fair, do you think? Or did you, like in hindsight even, I think it's fine to look in hindsight and say like, yes, we were right or we were wrong as like a market. But do you think that we did kind of overstate Wilson and his ability? I think
in his ability, I think we did. I think the numbers part of it, I think we certainly have right. Because again, we thought it was going to be the Garrett Wilson show. We didn't think that, we didn't think Alan Lazar was going to show up like Steve Buscemi and, in Billy Madison to make a big time cameo anywhere along the way. But I think in terms of ability, we were like, Garrett Wilson is amazing. That alone is going to carry the day. Forget everything else. So I think that part we probably did get a little bit too hyped on. But I also think that in terms of where we had him, you're talking about that end of the first round, early second round. The receivers I feel like we had there were guys that all sort of had some question marks. And we just felt like Garrett Wilson maybe was the best of that group.
Yeah, exactly. Like sort of at the top of the tier, like after AJ Brown was gone, it's like, okay, you can go, Puka or whatever, or you could lean Garrett Wilson if you're worried about injury or whatever. But yeah, I think it's a fair question to at least ask and reflect on though, because, we saw what we saw, and he's been, at times this year relatively inefficient, as we know. And, that plays into, is he that kind of player? And the fact that the Jets went out, now look, the Jets go out and they make that move. It was definitely a desperation, they're trying to just do anything at this point to maintain and be able to survive after going all in. But I do think, I know that people had the take that like, the Jets don't need Davante Adams because they have so many other problems and stuff, which I don't disagree with, but I also think that you can always use Davante Adams.
Right. I mean, who doesn't need Davante Adams?
Right. Exactly. This episode is sponsored by Underdog. Underdog is the easiest place to play fantasy sports, and they give you a ton of different games and contests to choose from each week. If you think drafting is over because the season started, you'd be wrong. You can draft teams over there each week in literal minutes. Right now, if you sign up on Underdog with promo code LATEROUND, you not only get a deposit offer of up to $1,000, but you also get access to my rest of season rankings. Those will be emailed to you once you sign up. But when you sign up, you have to use promo code LATEROUND. Head to underdogfantasy.com or download the app to do so. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. A team that definitely needed some wide receiver help was Buffalo. And they go out, they get Amari Cooper. We've seen Khalil Shakir kind of have this slot role and perform pretty well. Dalton Kincaid over the last few weeks has finally seen at least higher target shares. The production hasn't been amazing, but his target shares have been there. Where are you at with Amari Cooper? What's his ceiling like to you? And then what about these other pieces in Buffalo, like a Keon Coleman, a Shakir, Dalton Kincaid?
Well, I think first off, I think he elevates everybody else because he's a guy who's going to take some attention, especially on the outside from, away from, because with Keon Coleman, I think he's got some nice attributes. I think he's had some nice moments, but I think on a week-to-week basis, he's struggled to be consistent so far. I think one thing that I've taken away from this team is that, the week they didn't have Khalil Shakir, that passing game really struggled. And I think that's a really big statement there. So I think Amari Cooper is a guy who probably maxes out now as a high-end wide receiver too in this offense because he's going to take some of that attention. He's a nice piece to have on the outside, but at the same time, Josh Allen is pretty good about spreading the ball around. He's not necessarily going to lock in on one guy. So I don't think it's a situation where Amari steps in and is going to get, 28% of the targets or anything like that. You're still going to see Shakir involved. Kincaid's going to get his opportunities. You'll get we'll all get fooled by the occasional Dawson Knox touchdown where it's like we see the 8 on the front of the jersey. We're like, oh no, that's not our guy. And it's still to factor in that you're going to have James Cook get his targets. You're apparently going to have Ray Davis getting downfield targets based on what we saw on Monday night. So I think this is just sort of one more thing that forces defenses to have to pay attention to everything. I don't think it's going to be quite like we're talking about in New York, where everything's going to be kind of funneled through Davante Adams and Garrett Wilson. This is still going to be pretty spread out, but now you've got a guy that forces defenses to have to kind of play the whole field to kind of widen out a little bit, and I think that opens some things up for everybody else in Buffalo. Yeah,
the other thing I think a lot of people are probably naturally, and this is not even based on like what I've seen on Twitter or anything. This is just based on how I would imagine some fantasy managers are thinking, where they see an alpha or, quote unquote alpha going to Buffalo. And the last time they had one was Stephon Diggs. And the last time, aside from the second half of last year, Diggs dominated in fantasy football with Josh Allen, right? I think that the key difference that people need to remember is that this Joe Brady led team on offense is so much more run heavy than what they were even a couple of years ago, whether it's Dorsey, whoever. And so I do think that's really, like, right now they're bottom 2 in pass attempts per game. Their neutral script ratio is like 21st in the league. It's not a pass heavy team. And so if what you're saying, like if you are a believer that there is going to be a little bit of a disbursement in terms of target share, I think that's a factor that people need to remember and think about in terms of like what Cooper's ceiling might actually look like.
It is. And I think also personality differences between Amari Cooper and Stephon Diggs, right? Cooper doesn't seem like the guy who's going to go and make a stink, whether it's in the locker room, whether it's in the media, about not getting his opportunities. I mean, I think there's probably a portion of him that's just glad to be out of Cleveland. Point.
I mean, some people were saying that he was just throwing like this season, that he's just like, I don't want to be here anymore, so I'm just going to drop some passes right now.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, he's going to be in a situation now where he goes from one of the worst offenses in the league to one that, is definitely a lot more productive and on a team that has a legit shot at making a deep run in the playoffs. So I think that alone is going to help. Yeah. But, you mentioned the Joe Brady offense. I mean, it's sort of predicated on getting as many guys involved as possible. They're not force-feeding targets to one guy. So, I think there's definitely an uptick for Amari Cooper, but I don't think it's suddenly like through the moon or through the roof for him, to the moon with him this year.
Yeah, I'm with you. Let's stay with the Bills and talk about a guy that you mentioned, Ray Davis. This is probably one of the more pressing questions in fantasy football this week, where James Cook banged up, didn't play on Monday night. We don't know at the time of this recording if he's going to be able to go this weekend. And obviously if he doesn't, then it's going to be the Ray Davis show again. But let's say that he goes and he plays. where are you at with what this backfield is going to look like? Like, do you think that because of what we saw from Ray Davis, he's going to carve out and now has a role within that backfield?
I think he does. I thought he would before the season. I mean, I've got plenty of best ball rosters with Ray Davis just sitting there waiting to do things. So, I think some of it is Sean McDermott traditionally has not rushed rookies into his lineup, at least not when he can help it. And I think that was sort of the case here. But we saw last week what Ray Davis can do a little bit. I think what helps is that he is a different style of running back than James Cook is. Cook's going to try and kind of beat you around the corner, beat you with his speed. Ray Davis, he's like that juggernaut meme, right? He's just going to lower the head, lower the shoulder, and try to run through walls a little bit. So it almost feels like what the Bills had a couple of years ago when they were trying to make Zach Moss a thing, and it never quite happened in Buffalo. I think we're going to see something like that. So I think if you have James Cook, you're a little bit worried. You're not all out panicked just yet, because I still think he gets a good target share in this offense. But I do think, the look of him being something akin to a bell cow, I think that goes away just because Ray Davis showed what he can do. Honestly, that play, that sort of scramble drill where he's downfield and he catches the ball, 20, 30 yards down the field, kind of gives you reason to think that, how do you keep this guy on the bench at this point? So if you've got Ray Davis, I think you feel encouraged. If you've got James Cook, you're a little bit concerned. Like I said, you're not all out panic, but this is going to be, I think that gap between their snaps and their touches is going to start to come down a little bit.
Now, as kind of stupid as this is at times, I do think there's a lot of, this is my more like subjective feel-based take about like how teams operate and stuff. Because look, I don't think that everything's gonna be answered, through numbers and through formulas and stuff. It's silly. But I do think that teams care about identity. They care about the way that their offense generally operates and the will that they impose on opposing defenses. Like it matters to them in terms of how they do that and how they approach that. And even obviously in the media, you'll see people like the NFL talking heads just talking about like, this is like Steelers football. Steelers football is always, you gotta run the football and play good defense. That's their identity. And even though in like the 2014 to 2018 range, it wasn't even close to that with the Steelers. But regardless of all that, it does kind of feel like the Bills want this kind of running back to be part of what their identity is. Like going back to Joe Brady, they've been so much more run heavy since he got there in the middle of last year. You could even look at it's not like their numbers from like an offensive efficiency standpoint and like like if you look at EPA, all that kind of stuff, it's not like their numbers were like dramatically different, after the firing last year and Joe Brady taking over. It's just that they now have this identity of hopefully Josh Allen's not turning the ball over as much and they are running the football more and they can win in that way and in that manner. And it just feels like Ray Davis fits that better than a James Cook. Well, now it's not that James Cook doesn't have a purpose in that kind of offense. It's, to me, it's kind of what James Cook was drafted for in a way. I just never thought that James Cook was going to be like a true bell cow, which was why the start of this year, I was kind of surprised that he had the workload that he had, not just because I thought Ray Davis was good, but I just didn't think that James Cook was like that kind of player that a coaching staff was going to want. Now he's balled out. Like James Cook has been great. I'm not taking anything away, but do you think that kind of plays a role here too, that they just kind of want this to be the way the offense operates?
I think so. I never got the sense that like you said, like they wanted James Cook to be the guy there. They always wanted somebody to sort of work alongside him. Again, that was, they were trying it with Zach Moss for a while. I think James Cook got that workload kind of by default this year because I don't know that they were ready to get Davis into the game on a consistent basis. But now that they've played him, they've seen what he can do. I think they can kind of sort of go back to that identity, which, look, there's still plenty of room in that offense for Cook. But now it's more crowded, right? You've got Ray Davis playing well. You bring in Amari Cooper. Some of those targets that belong to James Cook probably start to go away right now, but I think there's still room for him. Just, he's not a workhorse anymore. Yeah,
exactly. Another backfield where we have a rookie who, day 3 rookie who's been performing kind of out of his mind. I mean, he's been great. Is Tyrone Tracy. Devin Singletary's been banged up. Again, at the time of this recording, we don't know whether or not Singletary, I would say he's trending in the right direction, but we still don't know, if he's going to be able to go. But I mean, if you have Devin Singletary on your fantasy team, are you nervous as can be about Tyrone Tracy?
You're a little bit nervous for sure, because Tracy's been incredibly explosive. I'll say this, I didn't have big expectations for Devin Singletary coming into this year. I mean, the Giants offense looked like a mess. Like we sort of know what Daniel Jones is. Saquon was gone. He has outperformed my expectations. He's played really good football before he got hurt, for sure. But Tyrone Tracy has sort of been next level. He's been even more explosive in this offense. I think the thing that helps Singletary, you talk about identity, right? Or coaches being comfortable with guys. Yeah. Brian Daboll has a relationship with Devin Singletary from back in Buffalo, and they were very comfortable together. And so I think that sort of keeps him in a little bit of a lead role. I don't know if fear or concern is the right word, but I think the expectation for me is that this ends up being closer to a 50-50 split than I think we thought coming into the season. Because again, sort of like Ray Davis, seeing what Tyrone Tracy's done the last couple of weeks makes it really hard to keep him off the field, especially in an offense that really needs playmakers. I mean, Malik Neighbors is amazing. Darius Slayton had a nice game a couple weeks ago, but what do you do beyond that? And so the more playmakers you can get on the field, I think the better off you're going to be. And Tracy has proven that he can be one of those guys.
Yeah, and I think that there's at least a chance with Tracy that, at least from like if you're in a PPR league or whatever, like he would end up taking some of that receiving work as an extra. I mean, they made a huge deal out of that over and over again in their primetime game, talking about how he was a converted receiver, which look, it's a great story. It's a crazy story because he's an older rookie. Like I liked him as a rookie. I didn't think that we would necessarily see this so soon. But when you look at the running backs they had, whether it's Eric Gray or Devin Singletary, Tyrone Tracy stood out from what you're saying, an explosion standpoint. Like he tested so much better than those two other guys did, just in terms of their 40 and their weight adjusted 40 and their ability to show off that athleticism. He was better than them within that sort of realm. They didn't have that in their backfield. So I was like, all right, well, Tyrone Tracy can catch the ball out of the backfield. He's got more explosion. Let's see what happens here. And then he looks like a veteran in between the tackles. I mean, like he's not just been good as a receiver. He's been good at picking the right holes, and his visions look great too. And so I'm intrigued by that. And I think that at the very least, if it is a 50-50 split, he'd probably get the edge in the receiving game and in the passing game. And that would make me, I don't think that we can necessarily make the lean right now and saying that like, oh yeah, Tracy's taking over, he's the guy that we want rest of season. Cause like you said, I mean, there's a history with Singletary and Daboll. We just don't know exactly how it's going to shake out. But I do think that if Singletary plays this weekend, it's going to be pretty telling to see what that backfield looks like. Because it could be a situation where, Tracy just ends up kind of being the better value from here on out.
For sure. And like you talk about him being a wide receiver too. Like hopefully this actually goes the way we hoped it was going to go with Antonio Gibson all those years in Washington, where like, hey man, he was a wide receiver in college. Why don't you use him like that? So hopefully the Giants are sort of, they take a more proactive approach with actually getting him on the field to catch passes.
Yeah, the way I see it, and what's really interesting is that in my prospect model and in my guide and stuff this year, one of Tyrone Tracy's comps was Tony Pollard. And that's just an objective, like it just spits it out based on a few attributes or whatever. And, you look at that Tony Pollard had a similar-ish journey in college. It wasn't as long. Right. He entered the league like 3 or 4 years younger than Tyrone Tracy did. But I kind of see that workload and a similar efficiency from a Tyrone Tracy as what we got with a Pollard. The difference being obviously that this offense isn't going to be as strong as what it was, in Dallas. But on the flip side, Tony Pollard as a younger player wasn't competing with Devin Singletary. He's competing with a superstar running back in Zeke. Right. So there's at least a little bit more upside of like a backfield takeover with Tracy than there was for a guy like Tony Pollard. But that's kind of like the type of running back that we're dealing with here. You mentioned Antonio Gibson. That's another one who, I think a lot of us thought had a little bit more upside, but he's had an okay career, all things considered, not bad.
And he's having a pretty good season in New England, especially, when Stevenson's been banged up, he's doing some nice things. I think our expectations were higher than what he's given us.
Yes.
So that's it.
Yeah, I agree. He was definitely like a fantasy hive mind kind of player. Yeah. All right. Another backfield that is now muddied as can be is Tampa Bay, where you had, Bucky Irving was showing up really, really efficient, much more efficient than Rachaad White. We thought that, there was a chance that he would see just more and more work as the season went on. I don't know if a backfield takeover was ever going to happen, but he at least, had that flex appeal, maybe even low end RB2 appeal. Rachaad White gets hurt. Sean Tucker steps in this past week and he dominates. I mean, he was unbelievable against the Saints. Where are you at now? Is this going to be a 3-headed backfield?
If you listen to Todd Bowles, if he is, not just coach speaking, yeah, it's going to be a three-headed backfield. I mean, that was the comment I saw earlier in the day that, it's a three-headed backfield. They're going to ride the hot hand, which is basically the worst thing that you could hear as a fantasy manager that's going to happen there. Because I think right now it just feels like they are still committed. They still have some loyalty to Rachaad White because he's been their guy for a while. I think the thing about White last year that made him effective was because at some point the Bucs realized that we stink at actually running the football. So here, we're going to throw you a lot of short targets and sort of use that as our running game. And that boosted his value a lot for fantasy. He's not getting those this year, and he's not running the ball as well. And Bucky Irving has just been a straight up better running back. And then, as you mentioned, Tyrone Tracy comes barreling through the door. Like, I learned last week, by the way, that there is a Sean Tucker hive on Twitter. I had no idea.
I'm part of Sean Tucker hive for the record, Marcus. Yeah.
Okay.
I only say this. This is not a hindsight thing. This is not a he blew up and look at me. I love Sean Tucker. This is purely so I went back and looked at my prospect model. Mm-hmm. The best undrafted running back in that prospect model since 2011 is Sean Tucker.
All right. No, and here's the thing. I don't think it's funny because all the Sean Tucker, hivers who
it's really obnoxious for the record.
I mean, like all the folks who showed up, like in my mentions about it, like none of them seemed like they just showed up that day, right? Like, I mean, they were like
waiting.
They were digging up like Syracuse stuff. Like they have been on this guy for a while. So like, no, there are no bandwagon Sean Tucker folks out there. So like, I just want to make that part clear. All right. So, but yeah, you've got three guys in the backfield, two of whom are playing really well. Or at least one had one really good game. The other's been playing pretty well over a stretch. And then the third guy, who is the incumbent starter, it's just a complete mess. I'd like to think that after a couple of weeks of this, it's going to sort of shake itself out. This is just a bad week, on top of having three guys and they're going to ride the hot hand. They got to play the Ravens. So it's just bad all the way around. But I do want to keep an eye on usage, on situational matchups, that sort of thing, and figure out how Tampa's going to use these guys. And I would hope that within a couple of weeks, we can get at least a little bit of clarity. And maybe one of these guys just sort of drops out of the competition one way or another. And that just clears things up for us.
So I think a blind spot in my own fantasy analysis is I oftentimes will not lean into the possibility of sort of an outlier outcome existing. And I don't mean like outliers as in like the performance being an outlier. I mean more so from like a running back usage and how a coach, because running back usage comes down to a coaching decision at the end of the day, right? And so I sometimes have a hard time envisioning, it's very easy for me to sit here and say, I think Tyrone Tracy could overtake Devin Singletary in that backfield, because it's not like Devin Singletary is like a overly special running back where the team invested a lot or anything like that, right? So it's a lot easier for me as an analyst to be like, let's buy into this dude who I think is a good player and see if something, comes out of this, right? Whereas when it comes to a situation like Tampa Bay, I think back to the coaching decisions that were made last year, because Sean Tucker was there last year. Mm-hmm. I think back to how the coaches have talked about Rachaad White, the kind of workload that he got last season. And my I've gotten a lot of questions then this week from people where they're like, is Rachaad White going to be the RB3 in this offense? And my brain, I don't think, is capable of like computing the idea of Rachaad White. Like, do I think that White is significantly better than those other guys? No, not necessarily. Like, I think that the delta between like an above average running back to even a below average running back is not like massively significant, especially when those quote unquote below average running backs are day three guys or undrafted in Sean Tucker's case, who maybe just didn't get the opportunity because of that capital and the way that they spend. I mean, like, we just don't see these guys get many. Now, of course, they're probably not as good, and that's why they're not getting the opportunities. But Sean Tucker had a heart issue. That's the reason why he didn't get drafted, right? Like, I don't think that talent was ever the biggest question mark. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I have a hard time thinking that Rachaad White would just not be involved in this offense. And I think that would be the way that Sean Tucker is like super relevant in fantasy, like maybe a flex play. But do you think it's possible that Rachaad White would be phased out of this Tampa Bay offense?
I would be shocked if that happens.
Same.
I mean, unless he's just really bad or just keeps putting the ball on the ground, I don't see him completely going away. So, like, I just, worst case scenario, all three of these guys continue to play well and they ride the hot hand, and we're just like left trying to figure it out every week. But, I don't know. I think Rachaad White's the guy who's for sure locked in for the rest of the year. We can have this discussion again in the offseason to see what happens.
Yeah, it feels like it's going to be like, Rachaad White and Bucky Irving have like a similar split as they had before the injury to White. And then Sean Tucker digs into both of them just as his own like solo role, but maybe like 5 touches a game, like not it's unfortunate. Cause like I said, like it's a really hard thing to really put together because on one hand you can evaluate talent and say, I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if I'm looking at Sean Tucker versus Rachaad White as players, like, I can't tell you definitively without a doubt that Rachaad White is like significantly better than Sean Tucker. I don't know for sure, right? And so because of that, I don't exactly know how the coaches might be thinking, but given the history and such, and the way that they've used Rachaad White, it would just be a weird outcome if he just like is not involved in this offense, right? Like right. It just feels weird if that were to happen.
100%. Yeah, he's not going away. He's going to be there in some shape or form.
Yeah. Are there any other backups sort of across the league that you don't think are getting enough hype, but should be rostered in more fantasy leagues or should be rostered everywhere?
This might be me confirming priors, but Kamani Vidal is another one that I think needs some more opportunity. I thought he was going to have well, here's the thing. I came into the season, obviously, like, hey, Gus Edwards is going to be the number 1 running back in Los Angeles. J.K. Dobbins, nice story. Want to see the guy come back, but how much does he really have? And then Kamani Vidal sitting there primed to get an opportunity if one of those two guys falters. Turns out, at least the first few weeks, Gus Edwards was kind of Gus Edwards. And then J.K. Dobbins just exploded. Like, it's been great to see for a guy who's had injuries the last couple of years, who's been, really just struggling to get back. Now Edwards is hurt. He's on IR. So Vidal, it's funny. I don't know if you had the same thought I did, but he scores a touchdown on his first touch, that wheal route. He takes it to the house. He's a shorter, stockier guy wearing number 30. And I'm like, it's Austin Eckler back again, right? I think this is going to be the beginning of an opportunity. And while I do love the J.K. Dobbins story, this is a guy who's played very little football over the last couple of years. And you just wonder whether physically he's going to kind of hit a wall at some point, I knock on wood, he doesn't get injured, he stays healthy, but just in terms of stamina of a 17-game season when you haven't played that much football the last couple of years, I think is an issue. I think Vidal is going to start to get some more opportunities. We'll see what happens when Gus Edwards gets healthy, if this is going to be another kind of muddled backfield back there. But I do think that Vidal feels like one of those guys who is ready for kind of a late season boost that, if you've got him on your roster, could be one of those guys that kind of helps you make a playoff push. And if you draft him in best ball, could really be a big boost for your roster at the end of the season.
I love that call. I've been on the Vidal train, throughout the offseason. I like part of the problem that I had with all the Kamani Vidal stuff was that there was a pushback because, day 3 back, they don't do anything, whatever. But it was this idea that like someone would only like him because of the situation that he was in. I'm like, guys, I like him as a player. Like, I actually think that he's a good player. This isn't just he's on the Chargers. But when you combined everything, it was like, okay, Gus Edwards, he's maxed out at like 8 targets in a season or something really, really low. Like, he's not a pass catcher. J.K. Dobbins can't stay healthy. And then who's left? It's Kamani Vidal. And I think that he is he's kind of like a Jaylen Warren meets DeAndre Swift kind of player. And that's really intriguing. And in the way that we score points in fantasy football, we want guys who are catching passes. We want guys who can be efficient on the ground. And that's, I don't think that he's going to be like a bell cow for them necessarily, but they run the ball more than any other team in the league in terms of like neutral script pass rate and such. And the number of pass attempts they have is very low. And so they're going to lean on their running backs. I just, you look at J.K. Dobbins had 25 rush attempts last week. Yeah. Like, to me, how do you not watch what Vidal did and not want to probably give him a little bit more work here, even in week 7, just to get him more involved? Yeah,
100%. By the way, can we revise this whole like day 3 running backs thing? Since running backs don't get drafted on day 1.
Bro, I'm with you.
Yeah. Right? They don't get drafted on day 1 anymore. So obviously day 2 backs, we know those guys are going to get opportunities. Day 3 back, it's not what it once was.
It's not a death sentence.
Right. Yeah. It's just not that anymore. So we I think need to kind of revise that idea.
Yeah. And I think it's also okay when, like an argument against Vidal also was like, I think he was the 21st running back picked in the class or something like that. Like, it was he was pretty far down, but it's like the difference between even a late 4th in a mid 4th to a 6th is not overly significant. And I'm still, from just like a talent evaluation standpoint, I'm still going to lean into the guy that I think is more talented in those scenarios, as opposed to just saying, I'm going to lean in on draft capital. We've seen so many bad fourth round running back picks and bad fifth round running back picks. And I'm like, look, guys, I'm gonna look and see which guys I think have the best profile, as opposed to just leaning. And draft capital is part of that equation to some degree, but instead of just leaning in on that draft capital stuff. Let's move on to wide receiver. Brandon Aiyuk has been struggling all season long. Do you think that he turns it around?
I do think he picks it up. I felt like, the first few weeks, it was sort of his training camp, right? He did the hold in. He wasn't really there, wasn't really participating. And it took him a few weeks to kind of get up to speed. Here's the thing. Even then, he was getting open. He was getting separation. He dropped a few passes that I think normally he would have caught. I think he even admitted to something like that. I still think the usage is going to be there. The opportunities are going to be there. I feel like this week against Kansas City is a good opportunity for him, because we saw in the early part of that Super Bowl, he was getting open and was making plays. The Chiefs sort of made some adjustments and kind of took him out, but I do think he's going to get some more chances this week. It's maybe not the season that we thought it was going to be. I've been joking all offseason. The 49ers went out and paid their number one wide receiver. They also went out and paid Brandon Aiyuk, because Jawan Jennings was like balling out for those couple of weeks early in the season. But I do think at some point you see Aiyuk kind of get back involved again, because obviously Christian McCaffrey being out is a big deal for this offense, but they also need Aiyuk to go out and be a star in order for them to really make a run to try to achieve those Super Bowl dreams that they have. So I know it hasn't been great for anybody. I get people all the time asking me, like, is this the Brandon Aiyuk week? I think you're going to start to see him look more like the guy you spent the draft pick on.
Yeah, look, his peripherals aren't that bad. It's not like things have been sometimes it's just, we're still in a small sample size right now. Sometimes it's just about conversion. Like on my mailbag episode, I talked about Amon-Ra St. Brown and how he has a very similar target shares last year. He has a very similar targets per route run rate. The big difference is that his yak has been pretty horrible this year. It's literally half of what he was doing per reception last year. And sometimes it's just how it goes in a small sample. Like the guy doesn't break off a big one, and all of a sudden our perception of that player, is completely skewed. It's similar to Tank Dell earlier this year, where maybe he didn't look 100% exactly the same as he did last year, but remember that play that he had where he was literally an inch away from having a 70-yard touchdown. And if that happens, right, then all of a sudden no one's worried about Tank Dell. I kind of have that feeling with Brandon Aiyuk. Do you think there's any reason to believe that there not being any threat out of the backfield and Christian McCaffrey could maybe negatively impact Aiyuk down the field?
I think so. I think a little bit, right? Because that's a guy that, if you're the linebackers, you're the safeties, you have to keep an eye on. And that certainly distracts enough for Aiyuk to get down the field. I mean, Jordan Mason's done a great job running the football, but obviously not the same level of pass catcher that McCaffrey is. So I definitely think there's an issue there. But I still think, look, Kyle Shanahan is too smart of an offensive guy to not figure out some ways to get the ball to Aiyuk.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Is that we got to lean in on the actual good coordinators that are out there, that can scheme these guys up. Another player who is getting a lot of talk this week is Jonathan Brooks. It sounds like he didn't practice today. This is on Thursday when we're recording this. But things are trending in the right direction just generally, in that he's has his window open now to return to action. But Chuba Hubbard is playing out of his mind, and so. Do you think that Brooks could have a strong bell cow role at some point this season, or are you anticipating this just being a split backfield?
Yeah, not anymore. Before the season, I really did believe that. I thought once he got healthy, give him a couple of weeks to sort of ramp up, and eventually he was going to surpass Chuba Hubbard and kind of be that guy in Carolina. Not now, not the way Hubbard is playing. It seems silly if you're the Panthers and you sort of move him out of that role, right? I mean, I know part of the move to bring in Andy Dalton, one, was to not just be awful, but also to give you a fair chance to evaluate other guys on the roster. And I do think Brooks is going to get that chance. He's going to get his touches. But I think you're also getting to see a lot of what Chuba Hubbard is. And it was not a fluke that he made Miles Sanders irrelevant last year. And he's made him even more irrelevant this year. So I think it's going to be a hard situation for Brooks to just walk in and immediately take things over. I also think that's sort of why they've been slow walking this with Brooks coming back so far this season. So it was nice to see him get on the practice field earlier in the week. You mentioned not expected to practice on Thursday. So we'll kind of see where we are. They also have that 21-day window, right? So they've got 3 weeks. And I would think at this point, with Hubbard playing as well as he is, and the Panthers, let's be honest, not expected to do anything in terms of a postseason push, you were not necessarily in a rush to get Jonathan Brooks back out there. So I think the dream of him being a bell cow in 2024 is probably dying slowly.
Yeah, I would agree. And like in terms of like the median outcome, like it's most likely that we're going to see a split backfield, at least to some degree. Here's my, let me know if you think this is a stupid way of thinking about this. This is my optimistic, Jonathan Brooks optimism side. Okay. Mm-hmm. The optimistic side would be Chuba Hubbard. You know, this is a rebuilding team. They're going to want to evaluate their guys. They're going to want to see what they're all about. Late in the season, I'm not saying like week 9, week 10. I'm talking like week 13, week 14, like as we get into like the fantasy playoffs. Late in the season, do you think there's a chance, if we want to think favorably and optimistically about Jonathan Brooks, do you think there's a chance that they look at Chuba Hubbard and they say, he's a free agent next year? Like this is the last year of his rookie contract. We got to see what we have in Jonathan Brooks. So let's ride him out. Or do you think that coaches just don't think that way?
I think front offices think that way. I think owners feel that way. I don't know that coaches feel that way, and like, if you are, if you're on the sideline there, if you're Dave Canales and you're looking at this team and you're looking at Chuba Hubbard, and you're like, this dude gives us a chance to win week in and week out. I mean, you talked about it earlier, right? That running back usage is sort of a coach decision and who you want on the field. And so I think Dave Canales may look at this and say, hey, look, man, Chuba Hubbard gives us a chance to win. Now, he might get a tap on the shoulder from, the folks up above in the booth and say, hey, man, we got to get the rookie in there a little bit. So, I mean, I don't think it's a completely ridiculous idea. It's just a matter of how much leash they're giving Dave Canales to sort of make these decisions late in the year. But all of my Jonathan Brooks best ball shares would certainly love for your idea to be the truth.
Same. It was, like, I don't think that, and I had this conversation with some folks on Discord this week in the Late Round Fantasy Football Discord, where, it was a take of, somewhat of a hindsight take from someone that was just like, we shouldn't have been drafting Jonathan Brooks in the first place. Like, this was really stupid to be going after Brooks. And I'm like, look, I understand that. I think, though, fantasy football is about purely upside and about like playing into that, to a pretty intense degree. And if we're looking at a player like Brooks, who for all intents and purposes is a really good prospect. Like he looked good with my stuff. To me, he was the clear RB1 in this class. If he is the clear RB1 in this class, if he is a rated and graded as a really good prospect, and at the time in August, we didn't know how long exactly he was going to be out for. Like, there were some people who thought that he could play even before that IR stint and before week 4. And so to me, betting on that in terms of drafting that player, I don't think was horrible process. And here's my fear, is that we then use something like this against a player in the future where that then doesn't happen. Because again, I'll go back to like Todd Gurley. Todd Gurley tore his ACL his final year of college at almost an identical time that Jonathan Brooks did. And Todd Gurley was a league-winning player his rookie season in fantasy football. Like, he was, and it was in a terrible environment because it was that Jeff Fisher year before they finally, you were out there. And it was before they really turned everything around and get Sean McVay and stuff. But he still, like, Todd Gurley was still very good that rookie season. And so I don't want to use, like, I understand that this is probably leaning towards like an L, just in terms of like drafting him where we draft him, all that stuff. Like, that's fine. That's going to happen in fantasy football. I'm thinking more so about like how we can use this information in the future. And like, do you think even in hindsight, like, it was bad process to be drafting Jonathan Brooks, to our redraft teams the way that we were?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think the process was right, but there were factors that we could not control. You mentioned that. We thought he was going to be back earlier than he would. We didn't anticipate Chuba Hubbard playing as well as he did, as he has been, right? There were unknowns in that whole thing, and some of those unknowns have turned out the opposite of what we thought they would be. And so, no, I don't think the process was bad. I just think that some of the uncontrollables didn't go our way.
Yeah. One more player related take I want to get your take on. Anthony Richardson. No one knows what to do with Anthony Richardson. Do you have a feel of what people should do with Anthony Richardson?
I think he's a buy candidate. I mean, I think you can be trying to go out and get him, mostly because the manager who has him is probably a little bit nervous about it right now. The downsides we've seen from Anthony Richardson are what we thought they would be, right? That he had a lot of room to grow as a passer. He was inconsistent in that regard, but we knew what the rushing upside would be. Now, the thing that's frustrated me He hasn't really run maybe as much as he did last year. He has not had the goal line opportunities. I think the wild card in this was that last year he and Jonathan Taylor didn't overlap. Right. Yeah. Remember, Taylor had the holdout, then he had the high ankle sprain, and it took him a few weeks. And by the time he got on the field, Richardson was out for the year with a shoulder injury. So now we're sort of seeing what life is like with them together, and they're using Taylor as their goal line back and not Richardson so much. So that's a frustration. I think they'll figure sort of this thing out, understanding that Richardson on the field is bad for the wide receivers, but it's good for anybody who has Richardson in their lineup. And I think, if you're worried about him, I think you hold him. If you're looking to get him and somebody's nervous about him, I think you try to acquire him.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue that there are other quarterbacks sort of in his like market tier, like where people would view him that have as much upside as him, right? Like he's got to have more upside than like most of the pocket passers that you would be trading for him, or if you can like do like Geno Smith plus to get him, I don't think that like doing something like that would be a horrible idea. So right. I think you're probably right that it's more of a buy because the sentiment is just so low right now with Anthony Richardson overall. All right, before I let you go, give me a buy candidate and a sell candidate that you think is fairly obvious right now.
I think my sell candidate is way more obvious than my buy candidate. My sell candidate is Travis Etienne. Okay. It's not going well for him in Jacksonville. So it's funny. So last week he had that play that originally would look like a fumble. They reviewed it. They called it an incomplete pass. But also right after that, Travis Etienne turned up with a hamstring injury. Look, maybe he was injured. I have no idea. It also just seemed really convenient based on what had previously happened. Throw in the fact that Tank Bigsby is playing really, really well. And the Jaguars' schedule is not particularly friendly. The fact that they're always finding themselves playing from behind means they're going to be very, very pass heavy. Evan Ingram is back to take away a lot of those short targets as well. Brian Thomas Jr. has been a really nice player so far this season. There's just a lot of places to go with the football. Trevor Lawrence, not really the prince who was promised the way we thought he was going to be. Travis Etienne, and it sucks because you probably spent a fairly high draft pick on him, but all the arrows are pointing in the wrong direction for him right now. And I think it's probably time to move on. My buy candidate, though, is Demario Douglas. And nice. I was one of the people, I know a lot of us were trying to make Jalen Polk a thing. And at some point, maybe it does happen for him. But I think at some point we got to stop overlooking Demario Douglas because last year he was their number one wide receiver. It was weird to go back and look because I think it was Zeke that actually had the most receptions for New England. But Douglas had the most receiving yards on that team. And again, this year, he is the most targeted player in that offense. And we saw Drake May come in last week and not miss a beat. And that was 9 targets, I think, for Douglas, 6 catches, a pretty nice game for him. I think this week is another good matchup for him against Jacksonville over there in London. So, I mean, on a team that, I get it, the Patriots offense is not very sexy. We don't get very excited about it, but he is the number one receiver on a team that's probably going to have to throw the football a lot. And so, he's not a guy you plug in, he's not a plug and play or set and forget sort of guy, but I think he's a guy that pays dividends down the stretch. A guy who's getting a lot of targets and a team that's going to have to throw the football a lot. I think he's worth picking up right now.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by like I don't know if this is actually like a sticky thing or if it's something that actually matters. But if you go back to like Drake May in college, his best season was with Josh Downs out of the slot, and maybe this is a Josh Downs type situation. Josh Downs is better than Demario Douglas. Don't get me wrong, but Douglas out of the slot, like he's been I was into him this year from a draft perspective. I even made one of my bold predictions that he would catch more passes than George Pickens this year. Wow. And which I haven't looked at that, like where that stands, but I would imagine it's actually not far off right now just because of how run heavy the Steelers have been and how like not overly efficient George Pickens has been. But regardless of all of that, like I do think that there is some intrigue that there could just be a natural connection of Drake May, to Demario Douglas based on how he's approached the slot in the past. It might also be nothing. It might not be that big of a deal. I will say this though. I had Demario Douglas on a lot of teams that I ended up dropping after the first couple of weeks. And that's a little bit tilting that I had Douglas in some teams and now I just don't have him.
I mean, look, that's how I feel about Kamani Vidal because I had him on a lot of teams. And then I had injuries. I had guys who just were stinking. So I just had to make some moves and I dropped him. By the way, to your point, George Pickens right now with 26 catches, Demario Douglas at 24.
Let's go. It can happen. It can happen, baby. It's trending in the right direction. Although with Russ starting, maybe things change for Pickens a little bit. We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah.
But man, it was great to chop it up. I wish we could do it more often, but let everyone know where they can find you and all the stuff you're working on.
Absolutely. The main gig is at NFL Network, NFL Media, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. On NFL Fantasy Live, we air 5 days a week, 6 p.m. Eastern. Also doing the NFL Fantasy Football podcast, which in its various forms should show up in your feed 5 days a week. So just like and subscribe there, and it'll show up in your podcast feed. Also fortunate to do some stuff with the guys over at Fantasy Life. They have been great. I do a show on Sirius XM on Saturday mornings that airs from 10 to noon Eastern, and then the Fantasy Live show, which streams with Kendall Valenzuela and Ian Harditz, who are a lot of fun to work with. That pops up. I think if you have an LG TV, I think it's on the LG channel. That streams at let me get my times right, 11 Eastern. So many things. But just find me on Twitter at Marcas G, MarCasG. That's kind of the clearinghouse for all the stuff I'm doing.
Yeah, you work with great people too. Like all the folks. Yeah, Fantasy Life is great. You got. I mean, Florio's okay. Like
he's all right.
He's fine.
No, I saw he had kind of some beef with the other Mike Florio going on Twitter.
I saw that.
I stand with Michael F. Florio. I'll always side with my guy.
Yes, it is hilarious. It's like that's why I feel fortunate that my last name is so unique, because I'm never gonna have to run into something like that. Thank God. Anyway, you can find all my stuff over on lateround.com. Make sure you subscribe to the newsletter, the podcast. You can check out the Patreon, and make sure you take advantage of the underdog offer. But thanks again, Marcas. Really appreciate your time. And everyone else, thank you. And thank you for